not all of which were known to Columbus and his associates. One of which Columbus was aware was an Irish monk named Brendan, sometimes called the Navigator. Born in 484 of the Christian era, he was raised in a monastery in Ireland and ordained to the priesthood at age 28. He is best known from a 1500-year-old Irish tale, The Navigator, which tells of him sailing in a curragh. This is a leather round bottom boat, and finding what many believe was America. The tale speaks of all that he and his crew discovered, including icebergs, whales, etc. They spent a good bit of time in Iceland, where they found Irish monks already established. They speak of being pelted with fireballs, the smell of rotten eggs, apparently volcanic activity. They found what they thought was paradise, a land with vegetation, white lush, flowers, fruit, and colorful stones. They stayed 40 days and returned home. The voyage took 7 years, and he was in his 80s when he made it. He died in 577 at age 93. Into Brendan. Columbus and his brothers were cartographers, makers of maps, before Columbus went to sea. In 1477, he sailed under the flag of Portugal to Ireland, where he visited the monastery where Brendan had dwelt and founded, as well as Iceland. There is no evidence that he heard of either the Greenland or the Vinland sagas from Iceland. Though the tradition of Brendan was widely shared among the sailors of his day, it was common knowledge. In the 1480s, Columbus made a voyage again under the flag of Portugal, deep along the West African coast, nearly to the equator. Prior to this, the Portuguese had brought African slaves from West Africa to Portugal as early as 1452. The church formally sanctioned this slavery by ecclesiastical decree. Portugal had found the Azores Islands. Columbus visited them also in 1477. Spain had found and was in the process of conquering the Canary Islands, enslaving the native inhabitants when Columbus visited it on his outward journey in 1492. Thus, slavery was an accepted custom by the time of Columbus's sailing in both Spain and Portugal. Columbus was rejected on his proposed voyage by the King of Portugal because a couple of years prior, as part of the exploration financed by Portugal, a Portuguese sea captain had rounded Cape Hope, though not yet all the way to India. This led to the presence of India in Goa until 1962. Portugal was not interested in going west because it believed it had found a way east. Thus, we begin the book of people's history with 1492 sailing of Columbus under 3 ships. Following a resupply in the Canary Islands, Columbus had a rather efficient trip with trade winds to the Bahama Islands. There he encountered the Arawak Indians. The language they spoke was the Taino language of the Arawak language group, which occupied the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, and as you may know, Hispaniola is now the countries of Santo Domingo and Haiti and Puerto Rico. Zen does not mention a small previous native culture at the far west end of Cuba, which Columbus encountered in his second voyage. More important, He does not mention the Carib native group, which was to the south of these islands, coming from a similar and related culture on the mainland of South America. The Carib group, the Caribbean, had much better weapons than the Arawak inhabitants, already had a history of attacking and enslaving them, and in many references in Spanish sources of also being cannibals. Thus, the Arawak natives were already under pressure from the Caribs before the Spanish arrived. The Spanish sovereigns expected a financial return from Columbus from the wealth of China and Japan, the source of the spices in the Indies, and his discoveries. The two best sources of this transaction in the mind of Columbus and his crew were gold and slaves, as they were lacking the Orient. The gold and slaves were the obvious source of wealth to return to Spain. As the Arawak culture had a concept of community property rather than personal ownership, from them came gifts as well as food and water to the explorers. Some of these gifts were small gold personal ornaments, with directions generally giving problems of translation, as coming to the southwest from the Bahamas. This led Columbus to Cuba and to Hispaniola, where in Hispaniola some placer gold was deposited, which was discovered after the Santa Maria was grounded on the north coast of Hispaniola and wrecked. With the remains of the wreck of the Santa Maria, a fort was constructed from the salvage, with part of the crew left there, while Columbus returned to Spain, with several Arawak natives captives as examples of the possible slave trade, as well as enough gold to encourage the Spanish royalty to continue the investment with a much larger fleet the next year. The crew left at Navidad, the fort renamed because the wreck happened on Christmas Day. This crew failed to follow order, went after gold and general adventure, leaving the few in the fort unable to defend it when the Arawak patience finally wore out. Thus, none of this surviving crew lived to see the return of Columbus on the next voyage. The next three voyages produced more gold, slaves, and conflict with all the native groups. The rapid death of the natives, reduced to slavery on the Spanish established plantations, resulted in African slaves being imported as early as 1503. Bartholomew de las Casas reported that by 1508, only 60,000 of the natives were left in Cuba from an estimated 30,000 population, 300,000 population in 1492. A Spanish citizen, Bartolome de las Casas, very important, came to Cuba as a planter, was aghast at the treatment of the natives, entered the clergy, and wrote the Historia de las Indias, a major historical work, as well as an excellent indictment of the destructive treatment of the natives. This work, when shared in Spain, produced the Law of the Indias. It was under this law, by the way, that Oñate here in New Mexico was arrested about 1605 and returned to Mexico City for trial for his mistreatment of those in Acoma. The Law of the Indias was of further importance. First, a quotation from Samuel Eliot Morrison's Admiral of the Ocean Sea concerning the background of Columbus with respect to the treatment of the native peoples, followed by a translation quote of Bartolomé de las Casas on the same subject. Morrison, there never crossed the mind of Columbus or his fellow discoverers and conquistadors any other notion of relations between Spaniard and American Indian, save that of master and slave. It was a conception founded on the Spanish enslavement of the Guanches in the Canaries and on the Portuguese enslavement of Negroes in Africa, which Columbus had observed and taken for granted, and which the church condoned. It never occurred to him that there was anything wrong in this pattern of race relations, begun and sanctioned by that devout Christian prince, Henry the Navigator of Portugal. But Las Casas, who spent the better part of a noble life vainly invoking the words and example of Jesus against the cruel and inordinate greed of Castilian Christians, comments on these words of the admiral in stern and measured words. Quote, note here that the natural, simple, and kind gentleness and humble condition of the Indians and want of arms or protection gave the Spaniards the insolence to hold them of little account and to impose on them the harshest tasks that they could, and to become gutted with oppression and destruction. And sure it is that here the admiral enlarged himself in speech more than he should, and that what he here conceived and set forth from his lips was the beginning of the ill usage he afterwards inflicted upon them. End quote. A final product of the law of the Indias and what was organized in Hispaniola was the practice of the encomiendas, which was passed in 1499 in Hispaniola. This was the regulation which granted land title to the Spanish, which required all the inhabitants on the land to owe work to the owner of the land. This turned all the native inhabitants into serfs or slaves of whoever owned the land. This practice was brought to New Mexico in 1598 and was part of the Spanish actions producing the revolt of 1680. It was one of three Spanish practices no longer allowed with the reconquest of 1692 to 94. With the removal of these three practices of Spanish law, the Pueblo peoples and the Spanish were able to work out an accommodation which continued for years. End of chapter 1. In chapter 2 on slavery. In the ancient world and in Africa, slavery was a social status. Slaves could also own their own slaves. They could buy their freedom. Their families were usually respected and remained whole, and they usually had certain protections from abuse by the owners enforced by social custom. The Jamestown colony, 1607, was cursed, if that is a correct description, by English gentlemen who came to find gold and refused to get their hands dirty by such a demeaning action as farming. As there was never gold in Virginia, and they had no wilderness survival skills of any kind, the first few years of the English in Virginia virtually starved out the attempted colony. The shortage of workers capable and willing to plant and tend the agricultural crops necessary to feed the colonists in Virginia was a very limiting factor in this early colony. In Virginia, the English settlers were very outnumbered by the natives. While the English weapons were superior, the advantage was not as large as the Spanish had first experienced in the Caribbean. Furthermore, the Virginia natives were far better organized for defensive purposes by those under the Spanish. Thus, enslavement of the natives was an impossibility. The Pilgrims, 13 years later, were a special case, as they had landed in a location where European diseases had eliminated the indigenous group. Thus, by 1621, they were in an uneasy alliance with a local tribe weakened by European diseases, while both groups were under pressure from a larger native group to the west. So, though conflict took place between the Pilgrims and natives, it was in conjunction with already existent conflicts between the native peoples. The 1630 Puritan immigration had no such loyalty to native alliances and was possibly the most destructive of the three in terms of mass attacks upon the original inhabitants. Again, slavery was not considered an option for the treatment of the natives. Very importantly for the history of Virginia, in 1617, tobacco was first shipped out of Virginia as a cash crop to England, giving some source of trade income, something that could be sold in England for profit. However, tobacco is a dirty crop. I have personally seen the tobacco tars staining hands back at black in a matter of minutes in the process of being gathered while we lived in Georgia. The few new colonists coming from England could not provide the labor in Virginia necessary for this cash crop. Thus, the Dutch slave ship arriving in 1619 provided hands to work the fields. To quote Zen, quote, two elements that made American slavery the most cruel form of slavery in history. First, the frenzy for limitless profit that comes from capitalistic agriculture. And secondly, the reduction of the slave to less than human status by the use of racial hatred, which that relentless clarity based on color, where white was master, black was slave. The first element was present from the very first day these slaves from Africa arrived. The second was developed in the next few decades. The earliest records after 1619 show several examples of indentured whites and black slaves taking action together in opposition to their condition. By 1661, we had the first legislation regulating the situations where the two groups were involved in actions deemed illegal, though from the very first, the punishment of the black slaves was more severe than that of the white servants. The record of white servants and black slaves working together to share rights, to revolt, or simply impede the financial progress of the master seems to have no limit to frequency or variety of methods used. Black and white ran off into the wilderness together. Black and white partook of violence against the master together. In the 1700s, the legal restrictions continued to increase on this type of action, though without total success. First, in 1705, Virginia passed a law which granted to the white servants serving a time of indenture from 4 to 7 years for their passage from England a small amount of cash and 50 acres of land upon completing their service. This act of placing the white servant in the landholding class no matter how small, may have had significant bearing in separating the alliance of black and white, which was so common in the first 100 years of the slave experience. Secondly, there was and is a deliberate and poisoned misinterpretation of the Bible, which has and still is being used to deepen the separation between black and white. This involves the Noah passage, though not limited to it. It was first referred to in documents Zen has produced in 1736, but probably predates it. Contrary to the popular white evangelical understanding, it is Canaan, not Ham, who is cursed. Just read the Bible instead of listening to the poison of the preachers defending the perverted story of racial division. In actuality, the three sons of Noah represent linguistic groups and have nothing to do with the color of skin. Japheth represents the Indo-European language family, like the spouse of Bathsheba, who is a Hittite, an Indo-European group very strong in central Turkey around 1250 BC. Shem, of course, represents the Semitic family of languages, of which Hebrew is one. Ham referred to Coptic, Berber, and related languages of North Africa, north of the Sahara. None of these groups include those persons living south of the Sahara. The misconceptions on the contact with the inhabitants south of the Sahara is even broader. One of the four rivers flowing out of Eden in that account, the Havilah, quote, where there is gold, unquote, heads in the mountains of southwestern Arabia, flowing northeast to empty into the Persian Gulf near the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates. And there is gold near these headwaters. This river would have been active 8,000 years ago, though now dry. Its course has been determined by ground penetrating radar, though it now is obscured on the surface by sand dunes today. But the course has been tracked, and it did empty into the Persian Gulf near the Tigris and Euphrates. The Queen of Sheba's land is almost certainly what is now Yemen, as some of the special species coming from there and recorded in the Bible are now similar to extinct vegetation, which certainly was used at that time. And like we know also happened for certain herbs of North African origin, were brought to extinction through over-harvesting, resulting in their demise in the ancient world. None of these biblical references have any reference to Africa south of the Sahara, despite years of Sunday school and Bible maps influence. This series of myths continues to this day. This can be augmented by what Eleanor experienced during our time serving a church in Georgia, where the local physician, a white man, informed the community that the black citizens of the community were descended not only from Ham, but had migrated to the south and interbred with the apes, producing the present skin color. These myths, contrary to the Bible, are still being shared today and are continuing in the name of the authority of the Bible, sharing this collection of ignorance to the American public. End of chapter 2. We'll continue this with chapter 3 later.